that's chapter 5. And so it is the third of the knowledge areas, and it's pretty important. Okay. So what happened to my purpose? I swear to God, it was on here. Where did it, oh, okay, that's right. It comes up like that. I forgot. Sorry, I'm silly. Okay. All right. So the purpose one is to manage and maintain requirements and design info, and establish meaning, which means establishing meaningful relationships between requirements and designs, which, you know, seems obvious, but maybe not, right? And also assess proposed changes to requirements and designs and gain consensus on, you know, whether you're going to accept the changes or reject them. And also another purpose is to ensure that the business, stakeholder, and solution requirements all align to one another, right? Because there's different kinds of requirements. And and the detail on that is you want to ensure that the solution implements the requirements and designs. Yeah, that would be nice, right? And it involves a level of control of the requirements. And you have to control how the requirements are implemented in the solution. And it, you know, once again, that sounds kind of obvious, but it's not when you get right down to it, right? And then you also want to make sure that BA information is available for future use. And so, you know, part of the requirements and designs life cycle includes documenting it and storing it somewhere where it can be easily found, you know, so it needs to be well organized and accessible. All right, so these are the 5 tasks that we've got in this chapter for tonight. So it's trace requirements, maintain requirements, prioritize requirements, assess the requirements changes, and approve the requirements. So these are all very important. All right, so we'll go to task, we'll go to the, this is, you know, the usual thing that you've seen here, showing the relationship between the various knowledge areas. So, and once again, as we've seen in the previous chapters, it all feeds back into each of the different knowledge areas, right? So it's very, very interrelated. And business analysis is not just a process that goes on in one direction, right? It's you know, we do a certain amount of iteration, quite a bit of iteration, and you know, certain knowledge areas feed into other knowledge areas, which then may feed back into the original knowledge area that you were looking at. So that's the way it is. It's very related. Okay. So sorry, I should have probably taken out this slide. It's what I just said earlier. So I'm going to kind of skip it. All right. So the requirements life cycle starts out with a business need. And then the business need has to be represented as a requirement. And then it continues through solution development, and it ends when the solution and the requirements are retired. So the requirements life cycle, you know, definitely ends with retirement of the solution and the requirements, you know, because that's the life cycle of, you know, just similar to a product life cycle, right? When the product, you know, if you have various different products that are being created, and at some point the product is retired. So requirements are very similar that way. Okay. And if you take a look here, you can see that with the 5 tasks, you can see that the inputs to this knowledge area include requirements and designs, which is not too surprising, proposed change, and also something from chapter 7, the other requirements knowledge area. So it's requirements verified. And then the outputs there's quite a few of them. There's requirements traced, designs traced, and then we've got the maintain requirements and design, and then the prioritized ones. And then we've got changes and approvals. So that all makes fairly good sense right now, right? But just wait till we get into it anyway. All right, so, and then this is how this is how you would apply the BACCM in this chapter. So as it relates to the change, the need, the solution, the stakeholder, the value, and the context. I'm not going to just read this off. We'll get into more detail on it. All right, so let's start off with the first task. So the purpose of tracing the requirements is to ensure that requirements and design at different levels are aligned to one another. And you want to manage the effects of change to one level on related requirements. So basically you have to identify and document the lineage of each requirement, including its backward traceability, its forward traceability, its relationship to the other requirements. So, you know, what that ends up meaning is that you have a lot of numbers and, you know, you have 1.2.3.16 or something like that. And you need to make sure that you track, that you actually track each requirement and what it's a part of and what it affects. So, however, it says here, while traceability is valuable, the business analyst must balance the number of relationship types with the benefit gained by representing them. So, you know, do you want to sit there and just trace requirements for a million years and never go forward? Well, no, of course not. So at some point you have to kind of say, you know, I've done it enough, right? I've traced it enough. So I've got a quick question for everyone. I'm sure everyone has read the chapter and probably did your study sheets too. So the quick question is, which knowledge area and task has an output that provides a guideline for both of the Chapter 5 tasks, trace requirements, and maintain requirements? And so here's the answers to choose from. The first one is A, solution evaluation task 1 in Chapter 8, or B, BA planning and monitoring task 4 in Chapter 3, or C, requirements and analysis, design, and definition task 2, which is Chapter 7, or D, all of the above. So if you've completed the Chapter 5 study sheet, you already know this, and you can probably just take a look at your Chapter 5 study sheet and figure it out. So if you want to put your answers in the chat window, that would be great. And I'll just wait a couple minutes, and then I'll move and we'll see what the answer is, right? So hopefully everybody has some thoughts on this. Are you seeing some answers in the chat window, Aaron? Hello? Okay, it looks like we're seeing quite a few come in. I'm noticing that has more stuff.
Lots of bees.
Okay, I'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So the answer is, it says business analysis, planning, and monitoring, which is Chapter 3. Task 4 has an output called information management approach, which serves as a guideline and tool for both trace requirements and maintain requirements. And in fact, it's the only guideline or tool for maintain requirements. So the answer is B. So everyone who said B, that's correct. Yay. All right. I just wanted to ask that question because just to show the relationship, you know, among the various knowledge areas, I always like to kind of highlight that. All right. So, yeah. So requirements traceability, part of the purpose of it is to help ensure that the solution actually conforms to the requirements, and to also assist in scope, change, risk, time, cost, and communication management. Yeah. And to detect possible gaps in functionality, or it's possible that you've got an implemented functionality that isn't supported by any requirements. So why is it there, right? You may need to remove it because it's not needed and it might just not be useful at all. And then requirements traceability also enables you to do your impact analysis in a more efficient manner, make it faster and simpler. Also, it allows you to discover inconsistencies and gaps in requirements more easily and more reliably. And then you can also understand better the scope and complexity of a change. And it's also lets you know which requirements have already been addressed and which have not. And that's that's the thing you want to know too, right? You like to know that as soon as possible, especially which ones have not been addressed. So traceability also supports the requirements allocation and release planning by providing a line of sight from the requirement to the express need. So that's good, because we need to never forget that the requirement is a representation of the need. So, you want to go to section 7.4 and take a look at that. And here's also figure 1.1, process traceability. Okay. And so as you can see, there's a software requirements traceability with business needs, business requirements, stakeholder requirements, solution requirements, and then the design, code, and test. Okay. All right, I'm going to move on here. And so once again, here are the guidelines and tools, which are domain knowledge, and then the one we were just talking about, information management approach, legal and regulatory information. So that's always an interesting requirement. And oftentimes it trumps everything else. And then also requirements management tool or repository. So, and then the inputs are the requirements and designs, as I think we discussed at the very beginning of the chapter. And then the outputs are trace requirements and trace designs. And then task 7.5, which is define design options, uses those outputs. So, all right. So requirements may be traced to other requirements and may be traced to solution components or to business rules and other work products. Designs may be traced to other requirements and also to solution components and other work products too. So those are the inputs. And then the elements are level of formality. So obviously, the more formal your approach is to tracing requirements, it's going to require more work on the part of the BA that's doing the tracing, and more time. So especially as the number of requirements increases in addition to the formality. And then another element is relationships. So you want to make sure that you can link the requirements on various levels of abstraction or detected dependency, depending on your need to do that. And then there are several types of relationships. There's derive, depends, which is necessity or effort, and then satisfy and validate. And so here's one slide on this for your reference. So derive, a requirement is derived from another requirement. Requirements on different levels of abstraction. Okay, and then depends means a requirement depends on another requirement. So the types of dependency relationships include necessity, when it only makes sense to implement a particular requirement if a related requirement is also implemented. Or it could be that a requirement is easier to implement if a related requirement is also implemented, so it reduces the level of effort. And then there's also satisfy, where it's a relationship between a requirement and the solution component that satisfies it. And then the last type of relationship is validate, and that's the relationship between a requirement and a test case or other element that can determine whether a solution fulfills the requirement. So those are the basic relationships. There may be more, but we're just covering these. So anyway, all right. And then this is a little summary of this. Okay, so you got derive is different levels of abstraction, depends on another requirement. Necessity is you want to implement it together with a related requirement. And effort, it's easier to implement the related requirement. And satisfy, the requirement satisfies a solution, or the solution component satisfies the requirement. So, and then validate, which refers to a test case. Okay. All right. So traceability repository is another element of this task. Requirements traceability should be documented and maintained in accordance with whatever methods are identified by the BA approach. Because if you recall, part of the BA approach, there's also an information management approach and that type of thing. So requirements management tools can provide significant benefits if you have a lot of requirements that you need to trace. And it may be, you may have tried it manual approaches and it may take too much time or just not be manageable. So a requirements management tool may be required. Ooh, wow. Anyway, so unfortunately, I've never really used a really good requirements management tool. I've just used Excel files stored on a SharePoint site with links to other documents and other, and other sub-sites that represent the projects to which the requirements are attached. And it has worked for me, but I think a real requirements management system would be infinitely easier and would be better and probably would keep us from missing certain things. But anyway, I just wanted to put that forward. Maybe some of you have used requirements management systems. I really have not, but I think I would like to. Okay, and then the guidelines and tools are domain knowledge. Okay, so that'd be knowledge and expertise in the business domain that you need to support the traceability of the requirements. And then there's the information management approach, which we already discussed, and then legal and regulatory information. And then the requirements management tools and repository. So as they say here, it may be as simple as a text document or as complex as a dedicated requirements management tool, which would be nice, or an RMS, requirements management system. So the techniques in trace requirements are business rules analysis. Okay, that's where you trace business rules to requirements that they support or rules that support requirements. And then functional decomposition, which is used to break down the solution scope into smaller components. And then also you may use functional decomp in order to trace the high-level components down to the more specific low-level concepts. And then there's also process modeling, where you want to visually show the future state processes. And also you would want to trace requirements to a future state process with process modeling. Okay, there's also scope modeling, and that is used to visually depict scope, also used to trace requirements to the area of scope that the requirement supports. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and talk about one of the techniques here, which is business rules analysis. Okay, so business rules analysis, you want to identify, express, validate, refine, and organize the rules that shape various aspects of day-to-day business behavior and guide the decision-making. So business policies and rules guide the day-to-day operation of the business and its processes, and they shape decisions. A business policy is a directive concerned with broadly controlling, influencing, or regulating the actions of an enterprise and the people in it. So it's typically or it should be anyway, a specific testable directive that serves as a criterion for guiding behavior, shaping judgments, or making decisions. And it must be practicable, and it's always under the control of the business. So basic principles for business rules are basing them on standard business vocabulary so that they can be validated and understood easily. And then expressing them separately from how they will be enforced. In other words, you say the business rule or, write the business rule, but you don't necessarily say how you're going to enforce it as part of that business rule. How it's going to be enforced is a separate item. And then you want to define them at the atomic level, as in at kind of the, the lowest level at very specific level, and in a declarative format. And separate them from the processes that they support or constrain, and then map them to decisions that the rule supports or constrains. And then you maintain them because they should be able to be monitored, and you may need to adapt or change them as as the business evolves over time, as circumstances change, because that does happen. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. And so, so definitional rules shape the concepts or produce knowledge or information, indicate something that is necessarily true or untrue about a concept. And they also always have to do with the operational knowledge of the organization. They can't be violated, but they can often be misapplied, and you can see how that would happen. And they are prescriptive. So they prescribe how information may be derived, inferred, or calculated based on information available to the business. And an example of a definitional rule is a customer must be considered a preferred customer if they place more than 10 orders per month. Okay. And then an example of a calculation rule is an order's local jurisdiction tax amount must be calculated as the sum of the prices of all the orders all the orders taxable ordered items times the local jurisdiction tax rate amount. Okay. And then there's behavioral rules. So these are people rules, even if it's automated. So they serve to shape and govern day-to-day business activity by placing some obligation or prohibition on conduct or action or procedure. And they're rules the organization chooses to enforce. And hopefully they are to reduce risk or enhance productivity. And frequently, behavioral rules will make use of the information or knowledge produced by the definitional rules. And they're intended to guide the actions of people working within the organization or possibly with people who interact with the organization. And it typically obliges individuals to perform actions in a certain way and prevent them from carrying out actions, maybe, or prescribe the conditions under which something can be correctly done. Okay. So behavioral rules can definitely be violated. Various examples of enforcement may be specified for a behavioral rule. For example, you may say you allow 0 violations, it's a 0 tolerance policy, or it can be overridden by someone who's authorized to do that, or it can be overridden if there's an explanation, or there's no active enforcement. So an example of a behavioral rule is an order must not be placed when the billing address provided by the customer does not match the address on file with the credit card provider. And that's in general enforced by AVS checking. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but credit cards have AVS checking, right? Where you have to, you have to have the correct billing address that actually is on file with the credit card. And there are some organizations that ignore that. We had a company helping us out. They were setting up they were helping us with a new website, and we wanted them to conform to the rules we already had about AVS checking that we already had in place. And they were saying, but why would you do that? Because you would, even if it didn't match, you'd let it go through anyway, wouldn't you? And I said, so what's the average dollar amount of your most recent clients' orders? And they said, well, $10, $15. I said, right. But ours are like, average is like $3,000. So no, we don't want stuff to go through if the billing address doesn't match, right? So anyway, strengths of business rules analysis is that, if you have a single engine that enforces and manages them, then you can implement changes to the business rules quickly. And, if you have a centralized repository, it helps you to reuse the business rules across the organization. And they give a structure to the business behavior of the individuals. And by clearly defining and managing business rules, organizations can make changes to policy without altering actual processes or systems. Now, the limitations are, you could end up having a lot of business rules, and some of them might not be easily understandable. So that's a limitation. There's nothing that forces you to make understandable, unambiguous business rules. And you can have 2 rules that contradict each other, or they may produce unanticipated results. And then if your available vocabulary is not, as they call it, sufficiently rich, you know, or not business friendly, the various business rules may be inaccurate or contradictory, or nobody will understand them, you know, in which case, you know, why have them, right? So here's an example of some behavioral rules. So I've got one here. It says only VPs and above can authorize operational or capital expenditures of $50,000 or more. And then the exception to the above rule is if a purchase order is entered into the system by a purchasing analyst for goods from the North American manufacturing subsidiary to be sold by the North American sales subsidiary. Okay, so that's the exception to the above business rule, behavioral rule. And then the next one says only senior VPs and above can authorize operational or capital expenditures of $500,000 or more. And then only members of the board of directors can authorize operational or capital expenditures of $5 million or more. So that's kind of a simple example. I hope it's fairly understandable and kind of specific, and everybody sort of understands it, right? And it's hopefully not too ambiguous. The only thing is the first rule has an exception. So anyway. So anyway, that's an example of one. All right. So moving on to the stakeholders. The key stakeholders for this particular task are the customers, because they're affected by how and when the requirements are implemented. The domain subject matter expert, who may have recommendations about the requirements tracing and the requirements relationships. The end user may require specific dependency relationships to be implemented. And then your implementation subject matter expert ensures that the solution being developed will meet the business needs. And then operational support have reference source, which they need, traceability documentation, for help desk support. So those are the stakeholders, and including also, of course, the project management, because the project manager needs to use the traceability for project change and scope management. The sponsor frequently has to approve the various relationships. The suppliers are affected by how and when the requirements are implemented, just like the customers are. And the tester needs to understand how and where the requirements are implemented, so that the tester can create test cases that trace back to the requirements, which is really important, right? And the outputs are traced requirements, which have clearly defined relationships to other requirements and solution components, and have clearly defined relationships to releases or phases or iterations within the scope. And then your designs traced is the other output. So you have to have clearly defined relationships to other requirements and solution components. Each design must also have clearly defined relationships to releases, phases, or iterations within a solution scope. So, all right. Okay. So that was the first task. And then the next task, yes, go ahead.
You had a question in the...
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
About meaning, could you have rules that don't actually logically work or break policy or regulations?
You could. You could actually, and those would be very poor rules. And so that's part of the reason why you need to analyze your business rules and make sure that they are, that they are correct. And you need to have a sponsor who, or someone high up enough who can approve the business rules and say, no, this one doesn't work, we're not doing it, right?
Yeah, that sounds good. There's also other discussions about judging rules and that, and they were talking amongst themselves and had a very good comment in there about the business person would set the rule, the system judges whether the rule was met.
Right. Yeah, and sometimes the system might even enforce the rule. You never know, but depending on how you have it set up. But yeah.
Yeah, so you could change the word judges to approves.
True. Yeah. Okay, any other questions?
I'm not seeing any at the moment.
Okay, and we're at 6:33, so does that mean I have 17 minutes?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Okay, good. So I'm going to keep
We
going.
can get into maintain requirements before first break.
Yeah, good. Okay. So moving on to maintain requirements. So maintaining the requirements, you need to do this in order to basically ensure that the requirement is accurate and consistent throughout and beyond whatever the change is during the entire requirements life cycle. Notice we didn't say project, we said change, right? Because it could just be some kind of a change that you're doing, not necessarily a project. And also maintaining requirements. This task supports reuse of the requirements in the future in various different solutions or various different initiatives. So, and then a requirement that represents an ongoing need has to be maintained to ensure that it remains valid over time. So it may need to have, some changes applied to it, right? So the requirement must be consistently represented, needs to be reviewed and approved for maintenance, and should be easily accessible and understandable. Or actually must be easily accessible and understandable. Otherwise it's, useless, right? And then if we take a look at the inputs, the guidelines and tools, and the outputs. So once again, just like 5.1, the input is requirements and designs. And then the guidelines and tools are the information management approach. And then the output is maintain requirements and maintain designs. And notice that where the input says requirements and designs, those can be in any state, right? They could be traced, they could be maintained, whatever, right? So, yeah. So the inputs, so requirements could be goals, objectives, business requirements, stakeholder requirements, solution requirements. And why did, for some reason I put solution requirements in there twice. Sorry about that. It's probably because it's really important. Anyway, and then the designs can be maintained as needed. The elements are to maintain the requirements, especially after an approved change, and then maintain the relationships among requirements or among sets of requirements. And then you also need to maintain attributes such as the source, priority, complexity of each requirement. And then an attribute may change even though the requirement itself doesn't change. So in your opinion and experience, which of the requirement attributes that were listed there changes most often? What do you think? Put your answer in the chat window. So it's either going to be source, priority, complexity.
I see priority, source, priority. So getting a lot of priorities. One person said source.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, once you get the source of the requirement, I mean, that's where it came from. That's not going to change, right? Status.
No, correct. Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and, well, wait a minute. Oh, I didn't put the answer in here. And sorry. Anyway, the answer is the priority, right?
Complexity.
Well, it's actually the priority that changes the most often because depending on situations and, changes to the sponsor's priorities, the priority of the requirements may change. Something might come up that's a bigger deal, right? So anyway, all right.
Yeah. So as you
Mm-hmm.
progress along and that you deliver some items, something that was low now becomes medium or high because other stuff that was higher has now been delivered or reclassified lower.
Right, because the business environment may change. All kinds of things can change.
Yeah, that could happen too.
Yeah. Okay. So then reusing requirements. You may have requirements that are intended for long-term use. So they need to be, identified, named, defined, and stored so that you can easily retrieve them or, and access them and they're organized well. And so you may continue to reuse a requirement within the current initiative or with similar initiatives that may be ongoing at the same time or maybe future within similar departments throughout the entire organization. You just never know. You may need to reuse those requirements. All right. And then the information management approach, which we have discussed earlier, that was one that indicates how the requirements will be managed for reuse. And that was the subject of the first question, in the first quick question. So, and then here are the techniques, which again, we see business rules analysis, data flow diagrams, data modeling, document analysis, functional decomp, which we talked about earlier, process modeling, which we mentioned as well too, and use cases and scenarios and user stories. So use cases and scenarios identify a solution component that might be reused, and user stories identify requirements that are associated with the story. So, all right, so we're going to look at data flow diagrams, which is one of the listed techniques for this particular task. So, data flow diagrams are used to illustrate the movement and transformation of data in a system. As I'm sure most of you have done some kind of a data flow diagram at some point in time. So it helps you to, well, it helps others to understand and to understand the transactions and the boundaries of the system. So it explains the transactions so that you can understand it. And then so the way you do it is you display the way the information flows among data stores, processes, and external entities of a system. And the data defined should be described in a data dictionary and can represent the system on various levels of abstraction. The data flow may be decomposed as needed. It may depict either logical or physical flows of data, either one or both. And it can show either the current state of a system, or it may show the future state that you're targeting, that you want to have. Okay, and yeah, I'd be surprised if any of you have not done a data flow diagram before. So so anyway, the elements are the externals, which are the entity, the source, and the sink. So an external entity is a person, organization, automated system, or any device capable of producing or receiving data. Externals serve as sources and or destinations, which are known as sinks of data. And they are represented by a noun that's inside a rectangle and must have at least one incoming or outgoing data flow. So we didn't actually name this external entity, but we put noun in there. And it shows that, you know, the external entity may have input data coming and then output data going out. So a data store is a collection of data or a physical location where data can be stored and repeatedly read. And so it's represented as either two parallel lines or as an open-ended rectangle with a label. So it must have at least one incoming or outgoing data flow. So you can see the two different ways down here that data stores are represented. So you can see in the first case, it's just two lines. In the second case, it's almost a rectangle, but it only has three of the sides, right? So it's an open-ended rectangle. So it looks incomplete. And anyway, so, and then the process for your data flow diagrams, it's how you transform the input data into an output. So it can be a manual process or an automated process that's performed for a business reason. And the process is represented as a circle or a rectangle with rounded corners. And the naming for a process should contain both a verb and a noun. So it can't just have a noun like the data does, right? It's got to have a verb and a noun. And then each process must have at least one data flow going to it and one data flow coming from it. And so the data flow depicts a transfer of data between processes, data stores, and external entities. It's represented as a line with an arrow. Okay, and it's named by using either one or more nouns or one or more noun clauses. So this is our next element, the data flow. Okay, so here is a data flow diagram. Is that GAIN Sarson notation? I never remember if it's GAN or GAIN. Anyway, so you can see that there's an external entity number 1, which is coming in to 1.1, process 1. And then you can see the output data from process 1 goes into data store 1. And then input data goes into process 2 and then goes out from process 2 to the external entity number 2. So this is a fairly simple data flow diagram. So that's an example. Okay. And then this is a different type of data flow diagram with different notification. It's Jordan-DeMarco notation. So once again, you can see how the data flows from external entity 1 and through the data store 1, through the process 1, data store 1, process 2, and then to external entity 2. All right. So the strength of data flow diagrams is you can use them to discover and document processes and data, maybe used for verifying functional decompositions or data models. It may help you facilitate the estimation of the effort needed to do the work. Typically, they're easy to understand, and they help to identify duplicated or misapplied data elements. Also help to define the boundaries of a system, and as necessary, helps you illustrate connections to other systems. So they can be used as part of the system documentation and help to explain the logic behind the data flow within a system. So, I mean, that's why you do it, why you create data flow diagrams, is to represent and explain the data flow. Now, the limitations are, if it's a large scale system, your data flow diagram can be really difficult to understand. It might just have too many arrows and, you know, lines and stuff like that. And then if you have different notations with different systems, it can, or different symbols, it can create challenges pertaining to documentation. And it doesn't really illustrate what the sequence of the activities is, and doesn't really say anything about the process or the stakeholder. It's just data transformation, right? So those are the limitations for usage. So, all right. The key stakeholders are the domain SME again, because the domain SME references the requirements. And then you've got the implementation SME who uses the maintained requirements. So the domain SME references them, the implementation SME utilizes them. And then operational support will confirm the current state. And the regulator makes sure that you're complying to standards or tells you if you're not. And then the tester uses the maintained requirements in a test plan and test case creation. Okay. All right. Do we have any more conversations in the chat box at this point in time that we need to discuss?
There's actually was a great conversation going on as you were doing.
Okay. I miss all this.
Somebody had asked what people's favorite tool for creating data flow diagrams was.
Yeah.
And a lot of people use Visio and
there's like an add-in. There's
Word
an
and PeopleSoft.
Yeah. I was going to say there's an add-in for Visio that is specifically for data flow diagrams. That's really,
they have a template, yeah, or it has what they call styles or stencils. You know, MS Word, Microsoft PowerPoint was discussed, and then a lot of people talked about Lucid charts.
Oh yeah, that's good too.
It's a paid thing that you can do on it. Here's a question about, is data flow diagrams an element? I thought it was a technique.
Oh, data flow diagrams?
Yeah.
It is a technique.
Yeah, so it is a technique, and it is defined in the techniques under 5.2 maintain requirements. Was
Mm-hmm.
5.2.4 or something, the requirements?
Yep.
So, we are going to cover, one or two or three of the requirements or of the techniques,
Yeah.
within the knowledge areas and the tasks,
To which they
they're
pertain.
listed in. So that's why she was covering uh,
Yeah.
data flow diagrams at that time.
Yeah. So yeah, I probably should have explained that, when I'm going through each task and we're looking at the various different components of it, and then we get to the techniques, and then I'm picking one technique of the ones listed and exploding it out for you.
I
So that's
promise I was paying attention.
okay.
So there is a question, does that mean it's going to be on the upcoming practice test? So I'd already answered that. Not necessarily. It is just listed in the BABOK at this time in this task, and that's why we're covering it.
Right. Okay. So
Any other questions or anything? Gotcha.
okay, we're 1 minute to break, so we could probably.
Yep, this is perfect time to take a break, and we will go. Now it's 6:50. So how do you like that? So we'll take break here. Everybody be back at 7.
Okay. Let's see. We already looked at this. We already went over this. So, and then the outputs for maintain requirements were requirements maintained and designs maintained. So, and the point about maintaining designs is that, it can be reusable, right? Once it's been defined. And same thing, requirements can be very much reusable. So, all righty, but you got to maintain them. All right, so the next one is prioritize requirements. Okay. And this one can be difficult sometimes, right? Hard to prioritize things. And as I think we discussed earlier, prioritization is the thing that changes, the priority often. The purpose is to rank your requirements in the order of relative importance. And, you got to do that so that you know what you need to do first and, what you need to spend the time and money on, right? So prioritization is the act of ranking the requirements to determine their relative importance to the stakeholders. So it can refer to the relative value of a requirement or to the sequence in which a requirement will be implemented. Okay, or both, right? So but it could be that even though a requirement is very valuable, we still might not be implementing it first, because it could be that there's other requirements that have to be implemented first before this one can be implemented because they're necessary. And so prioritization is an ongoing process. I don't know why I'm having problems saying that tonight, but yeah, so determining the priority is an ongoing process that can change. And so here we look at the diagram. As you can see, there are quite a few guidelines and tools for this one. So you've got business constraints, change strategy, domain knowledge, governance approach. Ooh, governance approach, that's a very important one, right? And requirements architecture, and then your requirements management tools or repository, and your solution scope. So that's a lot of guidelines and tools. Once again, the input is just requirements and designs, just like the first two tasks. And then the output is requirements and designs prioritized. And the strategy analysis knowledge area task 6.3 assess risks uses the output from prioritized requirements and designs. So it's from prioritized requirements. So that's interesting. So make note of that. Okay. So once again, as we discussed, the inputs are requirements of design. So it's any requirements in any form that are ready to prioritize. Same thing with designs. Designs could be in the form of text, could be prototypes, could be diagrams. All right. And so some of the typical factors that may form the basis for prioritization. Could be benefit, penalty, in other words, penalties for not implementing that requirement right away, or whatever, cost of the particular requirement, or cost to implement it, risk, various dependencies, which means, for example, if this requirement is necessary in order to implement other requirements, it's going to go to the head of the line, right? Even if itself, it doesn't seem like it's that interesting, but you got to do it in order, it has to be there, because otherwise you can't implement these other requirements. They just don't work unless you have this first requirement in place. And then, so then there's time sensitivity and also stability. And then here's another really important one, regulatory or policy compliance. And typically dependencies and regulatory or policy compliance, those usually those are the big deals. Those carry a lot of weight. So, even though benefit is obviously something that you want to get. And then there are challenges to prioritization, because different stakeholders may value something different. And so you could have conflict. And then, as it says here, and as I've experienced many times, stakeholders may also have difficulty characterizing any requirement as lower priority. And they may indicate priority in order to influence the result. Ooh. And so, those are big challenges. And then continual prioritization, because priorities may shift as the context evolves and as more information becomes available. And the basis for the prioritization may be different at various stages of the change. So as you can see here, prioritization can definitely change, and you may have to, as Aaron, I think, was talking earlier, a particular requirement may go into the background for a while, and be lower priority, despite the fact that it's going to bring a large benefit, just for various reasons. So, and then we already kind of quickly went over the guidelines and tools. So business constraints could be regulatory statutes, or it could be due to contracts that you already have in place, as well as business policies. And then your change strategy also provides information on costs, timelines, and value realization. So depending on what your change management strategy is. And then domain knowledge. So there are people in the specific business domain that have knowledge and expertise that should definitely affect the prioritization of the requirements. And then your governance approach will also affect that as well. And then you've got your requirements architecture, which you have in place in order to understand the relationship between the requirement being examined and various other requirements and work products. And then your requirements management system. So that way, which can be used as a way to sort and access the requirements. In other words, I want to see all the number ones, And then also the solution scope is a guideline and tool. It is because you always want to make sure that you're managing scope and that you don't have scope creep. And so you always consider that in prioritization.
So Kathy?
Yeah.
Sharon is asking, could you elaborate on what is requirements architecture?
Requirements architecture? Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. Well, the requirements architecture has to do with, and tell me if I'm wrong, Aaron, your requirements architecture has to do with what you've built, either using your requirements management tool or your manual process, in terms of tracing the requirements and determining the dependencies and what are the lowest level requirements that maybe make up certain components of the entire proposed solution and that sort of thing. So am I right, Aaron? I'm not.
Yeah,
right.
I think you're going along the right lines there,
Yeah.
especially when you said dependencies.
Yeah, because
dependencies on other work products, other systems.
Yeah, and relationships between the various requirements So that's basically what it is. And so, because that's kind of, it's kind of what you're building. You're kind of building a requirement tree, a little bit. Anyway, so, all right. So does that make sense, I hope?
Kathy, Sharon here. Does that mean that for the architecture, do we have to depict that in diagrams or?
You may. You could.
Right.
It really depends. And oftentimes if you have a requirements management tool, it kind of does that for you,
Right. Okay.
Well, it's also might be something that if you have architects within your company, if you're in a very large organization, you would have architects. And I work with a lot of enterprise architects and that, and they are there really to make sure that the solution you were designing is architecturally sound, and it works within the enterprise infrastructure and things like that. So it might not be something that you're building, but that you have to use and stay within.
Great point, Aaron. That's a great point.
Okay.
Okay, so we're at the techniques now. So we've got backlog management, and so that's used to compare requirements. And so you maintain the requirements in the backlog, backlog maintenance, and you may be reprioritizing them within the backlog. And then you've got business cases, which we'll look more at business cases in chapter 6, but it's business cases used to assess the requirements against various identified business goals and objectives. So, business cases, when you write a business case, if it's what they call a hard business case, you're looking at actual costs and actual dollar benefits of the goals and objectives, that sort of thing. What's it going to cost and what's it going to bring us? And then there's also decision analysis, which is used to identify what is a high value requirement, and then also estimation. And so various cost and benefit estimations can be the basis for prioritization. And we will take a look at the estimation technique. And then also financial analysis. So where you would actually assess the financial value of a set of requirements and how the timing of the delivery will affect that value. And part of the prioritizing requirements, of course, is deciding what goes first. So this is how the timing of the delivery will affect the value of a set of requirements. So, and then interviews, you may need to use interviews in order to gain an understanding of the value of the requirements and how they should be prioritized and how the stakeholders view that. And then also item tracking so that you can track issues. And then prioritization. Anyway, let's see. And then there's risk analysis. And so you have to understand the risks of, if you don't do this particular requirement first, or if you deprioritize it and put it in the next cycle, is there a risk associated with that? So you want to take a look at that. And then you may also use workshops so that you can understand why the stakeholders are prioritizing something, and you may gain better understanding and insight and that sort of thing into how to prioritize a particular group of requirements or a particular requirement. Okay, so the key stakeholders for prioritizing requirements are the customer, the end user, the implementation SME, who will tell you about technical dependencies between various requirements, right? And then the project manager, who uses the prioritization as inputs into the project plan, like the schedule, and also the allocation of requirements to the releases of the various, allocating the requirements to various releases. So once again, that's for the schedule and the release schedule. And then the regulator ensures that, or says it isn't or whatever, that the prioritization will be consistent with any legal and regulatory constraints. And usually a regulator is somebody outside, but then typically you'll have an internal auditor who is themselves kind of a regulator, and they know what the various legal and regulatory constraints are, and they can help you out a lot with that. And then there's the sponsor, who is the person that wanted it done in the first place, who will verify the delivered value of the prioritized requirements and say, yes, this is right. This is going to give us, this is going to give us the ability to achieve this particular goal or objective. Okay. And the outputs are requirements prioritized and designs prioritized. Yeah. So you want the highest value requirements to be addressed first, right? Similarly with the designs. Okay, and then I've got some guidance here. And this harks back to what we were talking about, how sometimes it can be very difficult to get stakeholders to mark something as a lower priority. So yeah, don't let your stakeholders mark all the requirements as priority one. I've had some stakeholders that wanted to do this, and so we had to have some deeper conversations about each requirement. Because I started off saying, well, we can't do everything at once. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough money to go out and get enough people. We don't have enough, dollars in this project to do that. We have to do things, we have to break it down. So something has to be number one, and then something has to be not number one. So I ended up asking a lot of questions of the nature of what would be the financial impact if we don't do requirement 11.A first? Are there any relationships between this requirement and other requirements, or among this requirement and other requirements that we have not yet documented? Am I missing something? Are any of the highest priority requirements dependent on requirement 11.A being delivered first? So you have to have those kind of questions where you actually ask, do you know what would happen if we don't do this one first?
Kathy,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Curtis just said that, if everything is rated priority number one, then nothing is truly high priority.
Exactly. Very good point.
So there's a lot of agreement in there. And you brought up a good point. If they're trying to say everything is high priority in that, look at the dependencies.
Uh-huh.
If you can't do requirement B unless requirement A is already there, or they have to be done together, that's a way you can break down and get the people your stakeholders to think more of, well, maybe this isn't such as high priority.
Yeah.
Such. And a good way of doing things also, start everything medium. Everything is a medium unless you have a reason that it's higher or lower than that.
Yeah. Right. Good point.
Moscow method. Must have, should have, could have type thing.
Yeah.
Won't.
I bet. Yeah. But I mean, and I've definitely had stakeholders that wanted to mark everything as must have. Oh, we have to do this, Yeah, but do we have to do it first? Right.
So yeah, Curtis, that's what the Moscow means is must have, should have, could have, and won't. So it's your requirement is a must have, a should have, or could have, which means it's lower in, a should have is and then you get down to could have is a nice to have, but not necessarily need. And the wants is we just not putting that feature in the solution.
Yeah.
Must have showstopper. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All righty. I'm going to move on.
Nice to have. Nice to have is what that.
There you go.
Okay.
Okay. So moving
Agreement
on.
there.
Yeah. Are we, let's see, how are we doing on time? It's 7:25. So we got 15 minutes to break. So we can go ahead and talk about this. Okay. So then there's also assessing requirements changes, because we know that requirements do change, right? They do. They just do. So we want to evaluate the implications of any proposed changes to requirements and designs. you know, because sometimes they just seem to change with the whim, you know, on a whim. So that's why you need to make sure that you don't just accept every proposed change. You want to definitely evaluate what the implications are. You have to analyze.
Lives would be so much easier if requirements never changed, right?
That's right. Yeah, but they do, unfortunately. I mean, well,
But
I
the
say unfortunately, they just do, right? Yeah,
well, the business environment changes, so your requirements have to change.
yeah, they do. Yeah.
Think of a project. I'm just ending a project that I've been on for a little over 2.5 years.
Wow.
So requirements have changed over 2.5 years.
Of course. Yeah. Right. That's why I always like to break down projects, make them as short as possible so we can get things done before, you know.
And Peter just noticed, everything has changed with the working from home
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. That is,
scenario,
all kinds of things happen. Yeah. You know, and, you know, I've definitely had projects where no matter how short I made them, the sponsor got fired and someone else came in. And obviously their requirements in many cases were, you know, what they wanted to do was a bit different, right? Of course. The last thing you want to do is come in and be the sponsor of a project by a guy that was fired and do it the same way that, you know, he wanted it done, right? Or she. So anyway, I mean, these
So
things.
yeah, if I'm gonna mention in the chat that when requirements change, if somebody's typing something,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
that would be a change request. Some organizations don't track changes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, you're probably in a really bad situation if your organization doesn't track changes.
Absolutely.
Now that's really going to be your job, is to track those changes, and if your organization does use a change request form or that, then make sure that each one of those is documented. Whether there's a formal form for it or not, you want to document where the change is coming from, who's requesting it, and probably do an impact analysis on what does this change mean.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, so yeah, you got to do it, especially, and as they point out here, you might have new needs, you might have possible solutions, and you always want to assess what the impact of the change is to the value, and and as well as does it introduce risk, or or something like that. So you want to make sure that the change aligns with the overall strategy and affects value delivered to, how does it affect value that's delivered to the business or stakeholder groups? Does it actually create value, or does it in fact reduce it? And how does it impact the time or the resources that are required to deliver? And how does the change alter any risks, any opportunities, any constraints? So, you want to make sure you do go through an analysis process on this. And hopefully, your organization is open to that, right? Because as you said, Aaron, you'd be in kind of a bad place if that's not the case. So if you look at the guidelines and tools there over on the left, you've got a number of things we've seen before: the change strategy, domain knowledge, governance approach, legal and regulatory information, your requirements architecture, and your solution scope. And then the inputs are, once again, requirements and designs, but in any state, but now the proposed change as well. Okay. And then your output is the requirements change assessment and the design change assessment. Okay. So, all right. So, yeah, so there's the inputs again that we saw in the diagram. So the proposed change can be identified anytime and impact any aspect of completed business analysis work or deliverables, and can be triggered by business strategy, stakeholders, legal requirements, or regulation. So you've got to assess the impact of whatever the proposed change is to existing requirements, and assess the impact of the proposed modification to the existing design. So you got to carry out that analysis and that assessment. And depending on what your business, what the organizational strategy is. You may have, and how they do things, you may have a slightly different level of formality, or it may be based on the information available or the apparent importance of the change. But the governance process is the big thing, your organization's governance process. So a predictive approach may indicate a more formal assessment process, and an adaptive approach may require less formality. And then you've got to have impact analysis, because you want to make sure that you understand how the change is going to affect or impact the solution, impact the value, that sort of thing. You want to make sure that you're able to do traceability, and then you want to look at benefit, cost, impact, and then schedule, and also urgency. So, because the change may be urgent, it may be something that's required by, a regulatory change, right? I mean, that's a good reason to have a requirements change. And then basically all impacts and resolutions need to be documented and communicated to the stakeholders. And then how the decisions and changes are going to be made and communicated are determined by your planned business governance, which is task 3.3. So it's back in the knowledge area of business analysis, planning, and monitoring. And so, hopefully you do have some kind of business analysis governance that you have put into place, or someone's put into place. And then the guidelines and tools, as we said before, change strategy, because that establishes context and sets the purpose and the direction of the changes. And then domain knowledge. So in order to perform an assessment, you need to have some knowledge and expertise in the business domain. And then once again, as we just finished discussing, the governance approach gives you guidance on change control, change management, that sort of thing. And then your legal and regulatory information. So that lets you know what you got to do in order to be compliant. And then your requirements architecture. The business analysis examines and analyzes the requirements relationships to determine which requirements will be impacted by the change. And then you have to consider the solution scope in order to fully understand the impact of the change, of a proposed change. So, this is pretty thorough, right? And then the various techniques that you can have are the business case, business rules analysis, again, decision analysis, document analysis. So that's where you go through any existing documents that might help you get an understanding of the change's impact. So that's important. Hopefully you've got those documents. Some organizations don't really have them.
Yeah, I was going to say, if they exist.
Yeah, right. And then estimation. So that's used to determine the size of the change or the cost of the change. Financial analysis. So there may be financial consequences. And then interface analysis. So you could have various interfaces that can be affected by the change. And then you may also use interviews, because you want to make sure that you're able to get an understanding of the impact of the proposed change. Because there could be a group of stakeholders that will be very much affected by it, or even one. And then you want to do item tracking in order to track any issues that you may have during the impact analysis, because you may have discovered various conflicts and that sort of thing. And then you once again want to use risk analysis and risk management, so that you know what is the level of risk associated with the change. And then you may use workshops once again, to gain an understanding of the impact. Or it could be that you need to resolve a conflict over whether the change is needed or not, or something like that. So you may use a workshop to, be able to gain consensus. Okay. And then, let's see. All right, so estimation is the one that we're looking at, is the technique that we're looking at for this particular task. So, and this is oops, sorry, I did that again. There we go. Okay, so now I'll be honest with you, I'm going to go through estimation, and the estimation example that I gave is not necessarily an estimation example for change, but it's a nice, easy to follow example. So estimation is used to forecast the cost and effort involved in pursuing a course of action, and obviously it helps you make decisions. And then the description of estimation is that it may predict uncertain values of important attributes based on knowledge and past experience. It can be expressed as a single number or a range of values, might include an assessment of the level of accuracy and uncertainty that's associated with the estimate, and may involve revising the forecast as more information becomes available. So you may have to perform the estimation process in an iterative manner. In fact, that's not uncommon at all, right? So there are various methods. We've got top-down, so that's top-down estimation, and sometimes that can be a very accurate way to do it, especially if you've got someone who is a subject matter expert. And then bottom-up is where you estimate from the lowest level elements or the lowest level tasks, or whatever with the largest amount of detail, and then you add it all up together. Then there's also parametric estimation, where you use a calibrated parametric model of element attributes being estimated, where you can find out things like, if it was construction, it would be sort of like you would get it down to dollars per cubic yard or something like that, and then multiply it times the cubic yard, the number of cubic yards, right? There's also rough order of magnitude, so that's a high level estimate that's based on common sense and analogous situations where, what the estimate was in that case, or what the reality was in an analogous situation. And then rolling wave, which I've never used before. That extrapolates the actually achieved performance for the remainder of the initiative or the project. And then the Delphi, which uses a combination of expert judgment and past history of estimates in similar situations or with similar things. And then there's PERT estimation, which computes the final estimate as a weighted average of its optimistic, pessimistic, and most likely values. And as I say, when I took the test, when I took the exam, the real CBAP exam, there was a PERT estimation question. I'm just saying. Okay. All right. Now, obviously, the accuracy of the estimate is very important. I'm sorry. What yeah.
And what is the key to knowing that it's a PERT estimation?
Oh, that there's 3 different estimates at least. That there's 3 different estimates. That's what it is. There's 3 numbers. And then it's PERT. So that's a good point, Aaron, because you need to identify that when you're on the exam and go, oh yeah, I know what this is, right? So the accuracy. So
it's saying that it's the most likely, least likely, and
so we got 1 minute to break. Now it's 7:39. Should we go ahead and take the break and then finish up estimation after we get back, or do you want me to press on and finish estimation?
Why don't we just go ahead and finish estimation then?
Okay. All right. Okay. So accuracy of the estimate is a measure of the uncertainty that evaluates how close an estimate is to the actual value. It can be calculated as a ratio of the width of the confidence interval to its mean value, can be expressed as a percentage. So rough order of magnitude estimates may be no more than 50% accurate, plus 50% to minus 50%. It's like, yeah, that's great. Yeah. And then definitive estimates should be accurate within 10% or less. That's something, you feel like, yeah, I can actually use that, right? I can depend on it. And then rough order of magnitude estimates and definitive estimates can be combined using rolling wave estimates, which, like I said, I've never done a rolling wave one before. So sources of information are analogous situations. So, an analogous situation could be something like you're trying to estimate how much it's going to cost to implement a new module of Oracle e-business suite, And in the past, you've compiled a a history of costs of what it cost you to implement other modules. So you can pretty much say, okay, at this point in time, I know it's, this is analogous to when we implemented, the financial modules. So yeah, all right, I think we understand it. It's going to be very similar to that. So it's going to end up costing us, $75,000 or whatever it was, Could be organizational history, which could be previous experiences of the organization with similar work, and then expert judgment, because sometimes you'll have individuals who have performed similar work in the past. So, all right, and they, and they know, and they'll tell you, that's going to cost this much, approximately. And then precision and reliability of the estimates. So the precision is a measure of the agreement between multiple estimates made for the same attribute. Can be done by examining statistical measures of imprecision, such as variance or standard deviation. Ooh, that phrase, standard deviation. And the reliability of an estimate is a measure of its repeatability through different methods or by different estimators. And then estimation of the same attribute can be performed using multiple alternative methods for assessing its reliability. Okay, and then you've got contributors to estimates. So the estimators of an element are frequently those responsible for that element. So the estimate of a team is usually more accurate than the estimate of one individual. So that's a good point too. And a dedicated group can be assigned for performing various estimations within an organization. And so if you have one of those, that's wonderful, right? And then organizations may also involve external experts to perform or to review the estimation. And then an organization may also compare its internal estimates against independent estimates for making adjustments to its methods of estimation. That was a mouthful. So strengths of estimation are they provide a rationale for making decisions regarding the budget scope and time frame. Without an estimation, you might end up with an unrealistic budget or schedule for the work, right? If you don't make an estimate. And systematic use of defined techniques generally results in a closer prediction of the actual value than just somebody saying, I feel it in my gut that it's going to cost this much or it's going to take this long. And updating an estimate through a work cycle, throughout the work cycle, allows you to apply the knowledge that you've been accumulating and make you more successful in your estimates. The limitations are, yes, if you don't have a level of knowledge about the elements that you're estimating, your estimates aren't going to be very accurate. And then using just one estimation method may lead stakeholders to form unrealistic expectations. So you may want to do several different estimation methods and see what you come up with. Do you end up with a similar estimate each time? So here's an estimation example. It's really quick. While teaching a project management course in cost and budgeting, I gave the students a group exercise where they had to do PERT estimation. So the scenario was, say you have a requirement to provide a bid to fill the potholes in New Circle Road in Lexington, Kentucky after the very cold and snowy February and March 2015. So that was their scenario. So they went online and they found an average cost to fill a pothole. And they also found the total square mileage and what I'm going to call lane miles of New Circle Road. They then assumed that they would shut down 1 lane mile of New Circle Road in 6 different locations in order to count the potholes in that particular lane mile section in each of those. So but they didn't actually do it, obviously, because they were students. They weren't actually a construction firm. So then they came up with fake counts of potholes for each of the 6 lane miles, and then they averaged them, okay? So they came up with, a lot of counts plus an average count. Then they calculated the highest pothole count, so that was kind of the pessimistic estimate, plus the lowest pothole count, which was the optimistic estimate. Let's see, and I don't know if you can, the example thing kind of went over the top of this. Plus, they multiplied the average pothole count by 4. So they had the highest plus the lowest plus 4 times the average pothole count. Then they divided that number by 6 to get a PERT estimate of the average number of potholes per lane mile. Next, they multiplied that number by the total number of lane miles, and then by that average cost to fill one pothole. And that gave them the total cost. And then the last step was they multiplied it by a factor of 1.4 to account for any additional expense and also to add on their profit, right? So
40% profit. Yeah. Okay.
no, part of it was a little bit of management reserve, in case it wasn't quite accurate. So anyway, yeah. Well, they wanted to make a large profit. You know how it goes. Anyway, well, that's what they did, and the reason why I gave them that was I wanted them to figure out how to do PERT estimation. They did a really good job. They worked together. So, and after doing that, they really understood what PERT estimation was. So it was good. All right. So
Break.
yeah, let's take a break. It's 7:46, so we'll come back at 7:56.
7:56.
Coming to the key stakeholders in the assess requirements task. So once again, the customers, right? And they provide feedback concerning the impact the change will have on the value that's provided to them. And then the domain SME can provide insight on how the change will impact the organization and the value to the organization. And the end user can offer information about the impact on their activities, on their job and their processes. And then operational support provides information on both their ability to support the change and their need to understand the nature of the change in order to be able to support it, and then and you have that in any kind of an initiative, right? Even if and any project or initiative that you're doing is some kind of a change, right? And so and you always have to make sure that you brief operational support and train them on whatever they need to be trained on, right? And then the project manager will review the assessment results and determine if it's going to require additional work, in the project or not. So what is the impact of the work? Okay. And then further key stakeholders are the regulator, because the auditors reference the regulator to confirm that we're complying to standards. And then the sponsor is accountable for the solution scope and can provide insight to be utilized when assessing the change. And the tester is consulted for establishing the impact of the proposed changes. So quite a few stakeholders on this one.
Yeah, when you were on that previous slide and I was seeing that list of stakeholders, I said, why isn't regulator there? Because
yeah,
when you're assessing the requirements changes in that, you want to make sure you have all the stakeholders involved in the discussion and approving requirements and coming up with those requirements for a change.
Mm-hmm.
And regulator would be a big one, that making sure that you're compliance with all the state regulations and other legislation,
Right.
And that, because if you leave a stakeholder out, you may be missing requirements, and you may making a change that is not really desirable because you didn't have the correct stakeholders involved. So quite a big list, like Kathy said, and that, but you want to make sure you have them all involved, so that you're sure that your change is appropriate and everything is considered when making changes.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. All right. Now, the outputs are the requirements of change assessment. So it's a recommendation to approve, modify, or deny a proposed requirement change, and also the designs change assessment. And once again, that's a recommendation to approve, modify, or deny the proposed change to a design. So, and sometimes you say, no, we're not going to do this change, right? It's not necessary, or it's not going to create the value we thought it would create, or it's going to impose too much risk on the initiative, right? something like that could be. You know, you just have to be open to it, right? You go with whatever the assessment, you know, proves. Yeah, so I've got an example here. Yeah, analyzing, assessing, and approving and disapproving requirements changes are important steps. And I've been lucky to work for organizations where we had executive support for implementing change control processes. So we did that. And there's nothing wrong with asking stakeholders to document the requirements change request in a form, and, you know, to defend their change with some numbers, or at least to help you figure out what the numbers are, right? You know, there's nothing wrong with that. They should be, you know, if they want to change, they should be willing to stand up for it, you know, by filing, you know, the form and explaining why the change is necessary. And in my experience, financial analysis has been the most convincing technique to use in gaining approval or disapproval on requirements and proposed changes to requirements. You know, I've always worked for companies where, you know, the financial impact was the thing that they liked the best. You know, and obviously introduction of risk, you know, if the change introduced risk, you know, that was a problem too. But usually we assess risk in terms of dollars, right? And you know, in fact, most organizations do assess risk in terms of dollars, you know. And then and you know, if the change actually reduces risk and you know, prevents loss of dollars or loss of revenue, you know, that's a good thing. And you know, it's a great proposed change. So yeah, in general, financial analysis I find is the most convincing. Yeah. So, all right. And then moving on to the last task, which is approving requirements.
Kathy, why don't we cover this one next, because we might not have time to get all the way through it.
Okay.
I wanted to have a little discussion.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, because it's 8:08. So sure.
Yeah.
All right.
So
no problem.
in chapter 6 has only 4 tasks in it, so
Right. Okay.
it won't take an entire 2.5 hours. But really wanted to have a discussion with everybody on you know, you would study this chapter. Hopefully you've read through it and you know, really studied it. You know, I have the homework from several people in that, so I think just about everybody's turned it in. Any surprises? You know, was there anything that really caught you off guard, or or anything you really learned as a great point that you want to bring out and want to have discussion? Anything that really confused you? You need clarity on anything? I mean, we talked pretty good about the PERT estimation. And it was a good example you had there, Kathy, about
Thank you.
it wasn't financial, but it was a good one. So,
well, yeah, it was financial part, the cost of the, you know, it was basically about how big it was going to be, you know, how big was that requirement? How many potholes were there really that had to be filled? Yeah. So, yeah, and I thought it was good for them. It made them, after they did it, they really understood what PERT estimation was.
and you get the idea of the whole optimistic, pessimistic, and most likely.
Yeah, exactly.
So, other than needing to study more, anybody?
Hi, Aaron and Kathy. It's not relating to PERT, but I have a question on a couple of slides back on the assessment of the change, basically the stakeholders. And one of them was it indicated the testers were consulted for an impact across the whole requirements. And where it impacts most with one requirement and the change of that and how that impacts on the other requirements. I know BABOK basically endorses that, but I think in practicality and reality, and dealing with testers, they usually are very boxed when they perform their testing or write their test scripts, and they pretty much follow their acceptance criteria. How would then they be someone or somebody of key importance to be consulted on the impact across from the end-to-end requirement cycle? I just find that a bit, I guess I'm confused, or maybe I have some questions on that. Do you agree with what BABOK was saying, or in reality?
I mean, the testers are the ones who, you know, assuming that they write their own test scripts and stuff, they're the ones that determine the acceptance criteria for the solution, right? So I think you need their input as well.
Because I often find the testers often find that they don't have enough insight across to the whole end-to-end. They do come back to the BAs to say, could you write out what the acceptance criteria is, and then we can write the test scripts and put in the rules or the testing framework around it. So I just thought that was pretty interesting that BABOK says that testers should be consulted on, because to me, I don't know if they can, and there could be very excellent testers out there, but to see everything from end to end, it just has some question marks to it.
Well, I mean, one tester may not see everything from end to end, but if you have the relevant testers, you know, they can provide at least their portion of the whole, right? And then you can get the whole, you can get the end to end. So I don't know. And yes, I have noticed that, you know, testers, you know, sometimes testers have difficulty with that, like you said, with the acceptance criteria and that type of thing. And I actually have an example in here in this last one about what I've done in the past to get people to get people more involved in writing the acceptance criteria. And it's sort of a provocative thing, but
yeah, that was just interesting. I thought I'd flag that out and get your input. Yeah.
But yeah, like
One thing I will have to say that I've had testers in there, and they really bring a different viewpoint. And they also are, when they're familiar with the product already, that viewpoint can also include things we're not thinking of, or no one's thought of, from testing scenarios that bring out some other requirements or things we need to have. So I've had some of them be very valuable.
Yes, absolutely. And I agree with you that the business analyst is the one that should be writing the acceptance criteria, because you are writing the requirements. You should, you know, add all the attributes, including acceptance criteria, to those requirements, but bring in testers in while you're developing those requirements, as well as developers. That's why Agile works very nicely, is because it's all done and everybody's there and thinking about it. But as you're building those requirements, you're giving the testers the familiarity with the solution that, you know, several of you have commented, Renee and Kathy and others have said, you know, that they need to know what the solution is, what it's supposed to do, and all of that. If they're there and as you're building the requirements and you're discussing it with the business stakeholders, you know, they're getting that familiarity and their understanding of what the solution is supposed to do, so that they can effectively test it. And as you're building the requirements, they can say, you know, whether they can test that requirement or not, whether the acceptance criteria, you know, has enough in it. You know, they can build a test case on it. Makes sense?
Well, that works for me. I don't know if it does to everyone else, but it's, or especially if it's a business tester, not just the IT test engineer, or, you know, someone that looks at it more functional. But when it's been a user tester in there, they really can sometimes bring, and their peers listen to them. So that's another thing to consider.
Right.
This is Rita. I find that, especially what you pointed out, Aaron, about the agile, when you have your tester and your business analyst and your developer talking with the business person or your lead there, they can have a lot of really interesting insight, but it makes it a lot easier then for them to be able to do their type of work because they're hearing about it from all perspectives at once. It's very useful from my perspective anyways.
Yeah.
Versus having to go over it again or explain the requirements a second or third
Absolutely.
time with them.
And as Anish points out in the chat box, even in waterfall, if you're doing a waterfall effort, having them involved at that process with the developers, things can start sooner and testing they can start building those test cases, sooner. And things work better and you can reduce schedules by having them involved a little more upfront and giving them that understanding of what the solution is supposed to do. So what was another comment? I have to find it in the chat box again. Someone said, so testers also provide more of the user perspective.
Also, this is Anish. Business testers usually come into picture during the UAT, right? I mean, bringing them early and asking them to test wouldn't make any sense until the solution is completely up and running.
Yeah. So Peter's asking to know how critical is it to know the matrix of which stakeholders are involved with each task in the KA in the knowledge area? You have a perspective on that, Kathy?
Well, it's a good idea to know that. And I'm not saying memorize it. I'm saying fill in your study sheets, right? Because there could be questions on it.
And especially the ECBA exam, but I think you'll see it on the CCBA and the CBAP as well.
Yeah, definitely.
They won't ask you for the full list or that. They'll ask you, from a perspective or,
Yeah. Which of the following stakeholders would not be necessary, to, when this is whatever is happening, right?
Yeah.
Or it might be something like that,
It could be, and it could be something. I think we had one on one of the just the practice test we just had about, what perspective or what stakeholder would assess the requirements to for seeing if they meet regulatory or legal requirements. So it may be something of that nature where it is, what is the purpose of that stakeholder being involved in that task? May be the question that you see on the exam. They're not going to ask you for, which stakeholders are involved in assessing requirement changes.
I'm not going to ask you for a big list.
Expect that question on the exam.
Right.
Just cram it. Okay, so nothing else really that really stuck out to you or was a real important learning point or really surprised you while you studied this chapter? Not really? Not seeing any.
Okay, so hopefully some of this was familiar to you from your own experience then. So that's good. And
Still
basically,
digesting.
yeah. Okay.
Sorry, Kathy.
No. Yeah.
So anything from the, like, especially these first 4 tasks, nothing you need more clarity on or you didn't understand as you read it? Or you filled in the student exercises or the study sheets? So it does take quite a bit to digest, and, you know, the BABOK is 500 and some pages, so a lot of content there, but I think as you read through it and you logically think about, you know, each knowledge area you know, it needs specialized skills of you know, business analysts in that work, um, the area of work, and the tasks kind of work together within that knowledge area to get a solution or requirements out, and work the requirements through its life cycle and the solution through its life cycle. So the techniques which I wouldn't say that the techniques that we covered are more important than the ones that we didn't. We're not saying that they're going to be on the practice test or the actual exam or anything of that nature. We really just selected ones that we have noticed in our careers or that are used more often, you know, that are likely, you know, to be very important, and something that would be familiar to you, you know, that you probably have seen before. Does that make sense? So we're certainly not saying, you know, don't worry about the ones that we didn't cover, you know, the techniques we did not cover in detail, that those are unimportant or anything. We're not saying that at all. And they certainly can be on the test or the actual exams. So don't gloss over it because, you know, we didn't cover it in detail. You certainly do have to. There's 50 techniques in the BABOK, and you do have to know them pretty well. You got to really know the purpose of them, and, you know, how the BABOK says that they should be done.
And when you go on Watermark, once you, you know, once you've scheduled your test and you get to the point where you want to start taking the practice test on the Watermark site, isn't there like, aren't there like some drills that are on the techniques? You know what I mean, Aaron?
Drills on the techniques?
Yeah, because you know how they have different kinds of practice tests on the Watermark learning site?
On the
like,
Watermark things, yeah. So you can do a drill by knowledge area or
and I think there's some drills on
technique or by underlining competencies.
Yeah.
You know, any of those things you can do that, or you can do a combination of that, or you could do a simulated exam. So those of you that do have the 5-day access code to the Watermark Learning, I still got to get those out to some of you, don't I? That do have that, when you do log in the first time and you use that code, your 5-day consecutive days start, and that code is good for 5 consecutive days. You can take as many practice tests as you want in 5 days. And as Kathy was saying, there's all kinds of different levels of tests, practice tests on there. And some of them might be like a simple drill over techniques that might give you 10 questions or 20 questions on just techniques. Or you could do it by knowledge area. And when you do it by knowledge area, you could maybe select 2 or 3 knowledge areas and have a combination of, you know, doing elicitation and business analysis planning and solution evaluation. You know, you could do that. Or you could just do one knowledge area, or you could do the underlying competencies. Or like I said, you can do a simulated exam where it will give you the same number of exam questions as in the actual exam, There will be 120 on the CBAP, 130 on the CCBA, 50 on the ECBA. And the clock will count down, what you would have on the actual exam to actually finish that exam. So again, you might want to use that 5-day access code a little closer to the time that you are going to sit for the actual exam, and just use that up in 5 days, Or, you can go out to Watermark Learning, and they have 30-day, 60-day, and 90-day subscriptions. That'll be an extra cost to you if you want more of their practice test. Being able to practice a little more, especially when you get closer to sitting for the actual exam.
Right, and that's what the folks from the Vermont branch definitely, they recommended that you go ahead and get the extended, the extended days of using the practice test. I didn't do that, but I want to say, did I even realize I could have done that? I don't know, but I didn't do it. But they found it they said it was really helpful for them. And the other thing that the Vermont, some of the Vermont folks said to do is, with the study sheets that you have, they said, don't just fill it out once, fill it out twice, before you take the exam. Fill it out again. Get your blank, your original blank one, and fill it in again.
Nice.
And they also, I think, who was it that also said, and if you can print it out and do it in pencil or pen, do that too, because sometimes that helps you internalize the knowledge better if you actually physically write it. And different approaches work for different people. So
the Watermark Learning practice test will tell you which answers you got correct, which ones you don't, and where you could go look in the BABOK for that answer.
Yeah, it tells you exactly which section to go to.
So it gives you that feedback.
Yeah.
Maddie, the session chat box here and that we are putting on the recordings page. So each week, you can go to your recordings page, and the session chat there's a link right underneath there to pop up the session chat. I saw somebody put it in the chat box there, but we saved the entire session chat box and put it on that recordings page. So, and the link to the recordings page is on the same link for your meeting invite. So you got the button to join the meeting, and there's 4 icons underneath that. One of them's to the recording page. One of them is to your discussion forum. Use that discussion forum to collaborate amongst yourselves for the students. Ask a question out there. Go and answer somebody else's question or that. That's a good place if you read something while you're studying and you just didn't quite get clarity on it, you don't understand what it's trying to say, put a question out in the discussion forum, and let's get a little discussion around that and try to bring clarity as what the BABOK is trying to say about these tasks or anything within these tasks. So a lot of people have said that pop-up questions that we're doing after the breaks and everything are good. So I'm glad you guys like those. How long will the recording be available post-session? At least 6 months. So at least 6 months after this study group ends, which ends is it August? I think it's the end of August this ends. So at least 6 months after that, you will have access to the recordings, the discussion forum, all that you have access to right now. So yeah, August 26th is our last session. Okay, guess what? We're at 8:30. Was there anything else that you want to discuss before we end? Any ballpark of the extended cost of the BABOK or the watermark learning test? I believe, I don't quote me, but I believe 90 days is like $99. So it's not super expensive, but it's, you know, there is cost to it. So 30 days, I'm sure will be a lot less than that. Not a lot less, but less. So it's a good investment if you really want to study in that. So, oh, it was $99 the 30-day access? Okay. So, yeah, especially, well, that's the CBAP. I think the ECBA one's cheaper than that. So it depends what test you're doing. $159 for 90 days. So Scott, those are for the CBAP. So the CCBA and the ECBA will be a little cheaper than that. And they do have the AAC, anybody interested in Agile. We will have a study group on that in the fall. But really, I really recommend to everybody one IIBA certification at a time. So don't worry about the Agile in the fall unless you already got your CBAP. You know, stay on this CBAP, and you know, if your goal, if you really want to make it an objective, not just a goal, get your CBAP, CCBA, or ECBA. Stay on that until you get it, and then you can worry about AAC or the data analytics or what other one. So do that. Yeah, you get it the day before the session. Is that the link to the meeting? That comes out one day. So every week you'll get that on Monday at 6 p.m. It comes out 24 hours before the next one. And our system sends that automatically. You know, I don't configure it or anything. I don't have ability of the time. I tell it one day before the next session, or each session is what it says. And it sends it out automatically, and it's been sending it at 6 p.m. There is homework. I didn't get that out. We are starting to study chapter 6. We will cover chapter 6 next week. I'll get the email out to you right away, but go ahead and start studying chapter 6. And I'll get you the links to the study groups and the study sheets and the student exercises. Is enough to prepare for the ECBA, right? If you put your mind to it, and if you really get dedicated, you immerse yourself in the material as we're going through this study group, if you do our 4 practice tests, and you can always do our practice test over. The link to that last practice test is still good. It's still open. If you want to do it again, feel free to. So if that's enough for you and you do the 5-day, well, the ECBA, you didn't get the CBAP study guide, so you don't have a 5-day access. Until next session. No, our interface is very simplistic and everything, and it does not randomize questions. It would be exactly the same questions in exactly the same order. So we don't have a sophisticated delivery system. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate you being here. Begin studying chapter 6. I'll get the email out right away. Thank you for all your time and your dedication for participating in this study group. We really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, we sure do. What?
So thank you for that expertise in teaching.
All right.
You all have a great week. Stay safe out there. And
good night, everybody.
we will see you next week. Have a great 4th of July if you're here in America.